morning, Warsaw. Today is Thursday, 24th of August. It will be cloudy in the morning with sunny spells in the afternoon with highs of 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:49 a.m. and sunset at 7:59 p.m. We are on the 24th day of the Warsaw Uprising and we will be discussing the American response. But other things are also happening today. What are they?
Amazing. Thanks for that, Feely. Yes, we will be talking more about the American response, but first of all, we're going to talk about what's happening on the ground. And Roger, take it away.
Yeah, there's sort of progress being made by the Germans across the border, all of those areas that they are attacking across Warsaw. So there's fighting, for example, for the Fiat plant, for the Polish print works as well. On every sort of front, they seem to be making some progress. Also, the Radziwiłł Palace is another of those areas that's attacked today. So it's one of those where you can see necessarily the beginnings of the collapse, but there's some German progress being made on the ground, which is quite significant. So some changes on the ground, but where that happens, Claire, you need to sort of change around supply structures and that sort of thing, supply chains. So how does that work on the Polish side?
That's right. The whole logistics of the city, it's like a map, isn't it, that's being shaken, and as streets are taken, the routes are changing that people use, the bases. There are certain depots they've been using as well, and they have to be moved back as the Germans are making ingress. So we see this with Zoe, who is of course involved in supplying food and medical supplies. She's constantly sending out search teams to check in the new areas that they've taken, if there are German provisions, if there's anything left from the shops or from the houses from before the uprising. But they, as I said a couple of days ago, they're being forced back. They have to keep changing where their headquarters are as well. And that means moving, not just when they're delivering supplies, but moving their bases back, crossing the city often under fire, and changing where the field kitchens are set up, and where there are hospitals in the basements, they're being moved as well. So it's massive logistical works going on the whole time as well. And so to give you an idea of the extent of that, there are about 100 kitchens operating on the 24th of August still, and 40 different aid stations just in one section of the city. So they can distribute several thousand meals every day. So earlier on in the occupation, people living in the countryside learnt about shortages in the main cities, and they would send food supplies into Warsaw. So that would be, sausages and baskets of eggs or whatever, sometimes illegally prepared moonshine to keep the resistance going. But during the uprising, that supply route is essentially cut off. Initially, the insurgents had thought it would only take them a couple of days to overthrow the Germans holding the city. So a lot of these supplies weren't collected at the start, and now very much it's a very improvisational situation for the cooks that are trying to feed people. These field kitchens, they're mainly led by women. They become important support bases, not just for food, but for communications. They're a bit of a hub altogether, for morale as well. There were a few tins and supplies. Every time these field kitchens are moved, then Zoe sends out her supply team. So they do manage to requisition some German supplies. Sometimes it's just a little bit of pepper and some sugar. Sometimes it's considerably more than that. They've got stuff coming in still from the warehouses of Haberbusch and Sheila, which was the beer producer. So they've still got a little bit of grain, barley, and a little bit of sugar from that, but those supplies are running low. They had searched along the river Vistula. They'd found a few self-seeded tomato plants, things like that. All of that is gone now. So now they are serving, basically, they called them weed salads. So that is, actual grasses that were growing on the roadsides, on the banks of the Vistula, whatever's left, instead of where there had been vegetable plots. All those vegetables are gone, but it's now the leaves of them. So carrot leaves you can eat, beetroot leaves, couch grass, not weed. There is a lot of nettle, so nettle soups are still made today. There are acorns, so they are being ground up they don't have big grinding machines, they don't have access to that, so they're using small personal domestic coffee grinders, as you might have in your own kitchen, but there's no coffee, so they're grinding up acorns, they're grinding up what remaining barley they have, and using those to make soups and hot drinks, basically. And of course, they're supplying water from these wells that have been sunk across the city, because the pipe supply, the whole previous system of water supply is now it's contaminated, and it's a source of spreading disease. So it's a huge organizational structure, and what's coming out of it is not particularly nutritious, but it is keeping people going. And these are being cooked up kitchens. It may be in the basements of monasteries, in the larger buildings that have still got basements that are fairly undamaged, filled full of volunteers and a lot of enthusiasm. People sort of thinking, well, this is something that we can do. We can cook to victory. We can do what we can. So this is some way that civilians are getting involved as well to try and support the fighting forces. And you have to remember as well that they're not considered to be in the front line of the Warsaw Uprising, but everywhere is essentially in the front line at this point. So a number of these kitchens, they're in basements, there is strategic bombing from above, and they are, it's incredibly dangerous work. A bomb falling at any point can take out a kitchen, destroy it, destroy the food supply, and destroy the cooks. So every job in the uprising at this point is incredibly hazardous. It's perilous work. And Alina, you have, I know, a personal story of a death on this day, a story that's connected with your family. It's not in the kitchens. It was a platoon commander who was killed on this day. Can you give us that story and how he's connected to you?
Yes, this was my grandfather's good friend and his platoon leader during the occupation and during the uprising. His name was Jan Potolicki and his code name was Rafał Olbromski. But I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him. He was young. He was 20 years old when he died. He came from an aristocratic family and he was the eldest of 3 children. When he was only 7 years old, his father passed away and he was brought up by his mother with the help of various private tutors. Remember, he came from an aristocratic family. His mother ran an open house and that would allow him to see important people and foreigners who'd come in and out of the house. And in his spare time, he would learn to horse ride and shoot, and he became an avid hunter. And at the age of 15, he was given a Mauser as a present. So we can already see here that he has some shooting experience. During the German occupation, he graduated from officer training, and what's really interesting, and I love this story, is that he trained my grandfather personally and his best friend Józef Trzeciński-Nałęcz, as well as many others, on how to shoot. He then became an armaments officer. He organised numerous warehouses, including the most important ones, which were, ironically, at Krakowskie Przedmieście. He also personally transported many weapons himself to the warehouses that he set up. I'll come back to this one in a moment, actually, this point specifically. He then became the squad leader of ODB-3, or ODB-3, which is a Kiev Special Operations Section in the Home Army. This very specific squad of men, it would be about 20 of them. They would liquidate Gestapo agents, among other missions. For example, collecting information, moving weapons across the city. And in the Warsaw Uprising, they became a proper assault platoon called, funny enough, Rafałki, which is named after Jan Potolicki, Rafał Olbromski. And just before that, my grandfather took part in one of his missions to collect and move weapons. And it's really interesting. They used a rickshaw to do it. And my grandfather, for some strange reason, seems to always put a gun to someone's head or side or something along those lines. And they got the help of the rickshaw driver because one of the weapons had fallen out that they were trying to move. And my grandfather thought that he would tell on them, but he didn't. It's a very interesting story that I could probably tell at another time. But anyway, coming back to the Warsaw Uprising, they became a fully fledged assault platoon and they became well known for their daring missions that they carried out, not just because of the occupation, but during the uprising too. They should have been with a different battalion, but they were asked to move to the Powiśle district, so down by the river, because they needed help and backup, and they didn't have any trained soldiers, or as many trained soldiers as these guys were. They were very well trained. I mean, my grandfather had to. He was the son of a general, for God's sakes. So even though he was young, he loved to mobilise people. His soldiers trusted him. He treated them like equals, and he was incredibly close to his men. During the uprising, they ate together, slept together, fought together, conducted missions together. They even got drunk one evening together which was the fault of, I mentioned her in the first episode as Halina Paszkowska. I love her, absolutely love her. She's so fun. She smuggled a few bottles of wine in her rucksack, and Rafał caught her giving wine to the soldiers. So he laughed at her and he said, you're getting my boys drunk, and locked her in a room as a punishment. So she decided to jump out of the window. But it's on this day that he dies. He dies on the 24th during the uprising, and he broke the hearts of many men and of course very many women because he was incredibly good looking. Not that that means anything, but just for me, I just found him incredibly good looking. He was also respected by everyone, and he was a leader that everybody looked up to, and he was a legend. But he was bonded with these men in a way that many of us could possibly not understand today. So let's talk about his death. He was tasked with liquidating the German artillery that was firing onto the Social Insurance Institution building on Smolikowskiego Street. This building is now the headquarters of the Teachers' Union. It still stands, and oddly enough, just a side note, this building was actually used to host the trial of Rudolf Höss, the first commandant of Auschwitz, because it was the only largest building that could accommodate so many people. And this is where their headquarters were. Earlier in the week, there was an airdrop that resulted in a load of weapons by the Allies that had been dropped. And inside the capsule was a pier and was a load of weapons. And this is what he was using to fire down upon the Germans. So he fired the first shot and it went too far. So then he fired the second shot and it was too short. And it was the third shot that hit the reinforced concrete beam above the window, and it exploded inside the hall, and the shrapnel tore open the arteries in his neck. He didn't live for very long. He died from his wounds, and because of the lack of space, which we will discuss later in this podcast, he was buried with military honours on the pavement of the same street that he died on. There were so many people at his funeral, and his grave was apparently filled with yellow flowers, and on the wooden cross there was a helmet, and it was placed alongside a yellow mine triangle. So this was a symbol of the Rafałki platoon. So I don't know if anybody's seen the German mine symbol. They took it and then they painted on an R for Rafałki. And if you ever see any photographs from the uprising, you can head to my Twitter page. I'll post up a load there. You'll be able to see where they have their little mines and their little symbols. But his death was announced in the Barrikada Powiśla, which is the Powiśla barricade. It's a newspaper that was printed in the district of Powiśla. This is dated on the 27th of August, and I quote, "A fresh soldier's grave covered with flowers on Smolikowskiego Street became the eternal resting place of Cadet Rafał. In a hard fight before the eyes of his comrades, he transformed from a boy into a man, becoming the model of a soldier who did not spare sacrifices and blood for the one he loved above all, for free Poland. Glory to his memory." I think his death affected my grandfather till the day he died, because every time I'd ask after him, you could feel and see the sadness in his eyes. But moving on, Roger, you've been doing pretty well with what's happening with the Soviets, the British, the Germans. What's going on there?
Yeah, again, you see, we had this this sort of three-cornered contest, really, between the three leaders of the Grand Alliance of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. And Roosevelt and Churchill had done a sort of good impression of presenting a united front to Stalin over Warsaw to try and persuade him to sort of come on side and assist, which obviously, for all the reasons that we've talked about over previous days, he was not willing to do. He was not willing to back the Polish resistance, the underground in Warsaw. They were obviously politically and strategically inimical to him, so they're antithetical to what he wanted to do. So of course he wasn't going to support them. But you're seeing now also cracks between Roosevelt and Churchill coming up. So this is something, this sort of tripartite relationship at the heart of the Grand Alliance is one of the sort of most sort of fascinating aspects of all of this, because both Churchill and Roosevelt, to some extent, but mainly Roosevelt, really believed that they could, in a sense, charm Stalin. You know, he was someone that they knew very well. You know, politically, they were on different planets, but they found themselves in this sort of Grand Alliance, and it was vital that the Grand Alliance had to stick together. They had to stick together to be able to defeat Nazi Germany. So they realized the sort of the strategic significance of what they were doing. But I think both of them, and I say particularly Roosevelt, believed that, on a human level, they could help that strategic goal by sort of, by buddying up with Stalin. And this was something that I think meant that Roosevelt very often was not willing to be the bearer of bad news, for example. He didn't want to tell Stalin how it was going to be. He was much more equivocal in a lot of his dealings with Stalin, which meant that it was kind of left to Churchill. And Churchill, by this stage, of course, is the weakest of the three. He's the one that's the most sort of supplicant of the three leaders. So this is one thing that sort of plays out today, is that as a message is sent from Roosevelt to Churchill. Churchill had previously suggested that they should present a united front in their dealings with Stalin. And Roosevelt basically says, well, I don't think it's really the right time for me to sort of, put my shoulder to the wheel. He said, I don't mind you doing it in your own name, but I don't think it's terribly advantageous for me to get involved at this point. So he's kind of, taking a step back from perhaps a slightly harsh message that Churchill wants to send. So it's indicative of that tension within the Grand Alliance, which doesn't help the Poles one iota, of course, but it's indicative of where we are.
It's that great irony of the war, isn't it? That first country invaded is Poland, invaded first by the Germans, 17 days later by the Soviets on the other side. Britain comes in. We often have in our national myth that Britain held alone or fought alone, which is never entirely true, but certainly the linchpin early on is Churchill. We have to remember that. But by this stage in the war, it's in 41. We get first in June, the Russians changing side, and they say the Great Patriotic War started in 1941. That's where they like to imagine the story begins. And then we get the Americans coming in after Pearl Harbor in December. And by that point, Britain never has that weight of authority that we had earlier on in the war. We have more allies, we have more strength combined. But from a negotiating point of view, and Poland, who has been, top table with Britain at the start, is now relegated from that table entirely and just isn't represented at all. So yes, by this point.
And worse than that, Claire, Poland is viewed to a large extent as an irritant in the Grand Alliance. I mean, obviously to the Soviets, but also to the British and the Americans. It's just seen as an irritant because it's getting in the way, as they would have seen it, of that, potential, not never easy, but that potential collaboration, which was essential to defeat the Germans. So Poland was just seen as a sort of a thorn in everyone's side by this point, which again, as you're saying, is just tragic. There's a nice entry today from the diary of SS Obergruppenführer Erich von den Bach-Zelewski, who was the SS commandant of Warsaw District.
Today I was at the front again until 2 p.m. A London radio station mentioned my name. Today we took Prince Janusz Radziwiłł and his wife Anna Lubomirska prisoner in Warsaw. The fights are hard, with great losses.
And finishing off on that simple quote by von den Bach, it is the end of day 24. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, go and please rate us a 5-star review on your favourite listening platform and send it all to your friends, because that's what you want to do. And we'll see you tomorrow for day 25. Thank you so much, everyone.